8 minutes. That was the whole of it. Out loud, the first time anybody said it. 8 minutes of open sand between the reed line and the fuel farm apron at the bottom of a spring tide with 16 port workers on the wrong end of it. Lorna Tolliver lay on the roof of the salt house with her cheek on the stock and her boots crossed at the ankle, and when the number came over the net, she did not move at all. Not a flinch, not a breath out of rhythm. The men below her heard it and looked at each other the way people do when somebody says a price they can't pay, and up on the flat white roof, the newest person on that whole task force adjusted a turret, one click, and went back to watching a gantry crane. The wind came off the water smelling of diesel and dead weed. Under her, the old salt store ticked as its tin cooled. 200 meters south, the stone mole ran out into the estuary and disappeared under a foot of brown water, and past that, canted over on the flats like something thrown away, sat the beached hull of the ferry Delphine with her bow ramp down in the mud. Staff Sergeant Wyatt Boland came up the ladder on his elbows and got low beside her. "You hear the number?" "I heard it." "You want to say something about it?" "Tide's low at 4:38, Lorna said. "The book's a rumor. It'll be low at 4:31. She thumbed a card in the sand beside her, a little laminated grid with pencil on it. "Tell Prosser not to be early. If he's early, he'll be in mud to his knees, and he'll be there 12 minutes, not 8. Boland looked at her for a second longer than he meant to. "You've been here 11 days, he said. 12, said Lorna. "But who's counting? If you're the kind of person who stays for the part where somebody gets underestimated in public and answers in private, subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're listening from. I read them. Stay to the end of this one. Before we're done, you'll watch a woman walk off that roof alone and wade out along a drowned stone breakwater with a sack of salt under her arm while the water is already turning, because there was exactly one line in the world that went where she needed it to go. And it was only open for 11 minutes a day. But that's 4 hours from now. Go back. 12 days earlier, the task force compound smelled of hot canvas and fuel and the low-tide flats, which is a smell like a bucket of pennies left in the sun. It sat on a bluff above the port of Koran Bay, a working harbor that had been a fishing town and then a container stop and then, for a while, nothing much. 2 big tanks, a gantry crane the color of a lime, a weighbridge, a pump house, an old salt store with a roof you could land a plane on. Beyond all of it, the estuary went out for a mile and a half at low water and came back in at a walking pace, and the local hires took that as ordinary, and the Americans on the bluff mostly never looked at it twice. Lorna Tolliver looked at it about 40 times a day. She had arrived on a Tuesday with 1 duffel and a hard case and a piece of paper that said she was attached, and nobody in that unit had asked her a single question about herself in 4 days, which was not cruelty. It was worse than cruelty. The task force had been together for 6 years. They had a shorthand and a set of jokes with the middles worn out of them and a way of finishing each other's sentences, and a new face in it was like a chair somebody put in the hallway. You went around it. You didn't hate it. She had learned water from her mother, and her mother would have burned the army down to the ground if she could have reached it. Corinne Tolliver ran a flat-bottomed launch out of a cut on a big tide coast a long way north of anywhere, and she dug clams in the summer when the launch work was thin, and she had a face like a closed door. The year Lorna turned 19, her mother took her out on the flats at 3 in the morning with a headlamp and a rake and made her stand still in the dark for 10 minutes before they touched anything. "What do you hear?" "Nothing. Listen for the edge of it. There was a sound out there, way out, like frying." "That's the water coming back over the mussel bed," Corinne said. "You hear that? You've got 50 minutes and you're already late." She set the rake down. "Now, if you get caught out here, which way do you run?" "In." "You run in and you drown," her mother said. "The channel's between you and the road. Bar's highest 100 yards further out than you think it is because that's where the current dumps its rock. The high ground's out, not in. Everybody drowns running the wrong way." Lorna had heard that sentence maybe 600 times in her life, on cold mornings and hot ones, and once through a phone line while her mother cried and pretended it was a bad connection. The week Lorna signed her enlistment papers. "I taught you that so you wouldn't die on a clam flat," Corinne had said. "Not so you could go be a target for people I've never met." They still spoke. Twice a year, carefully, about weather. And the other thing her mother gave her, without meaning to, was the ability to look at a piece of moving water and know where the road was. A bar dries from the far end first. A tide book tells you when and lies about where. Slack isn't a moment, it's a place you can stand. On her third day at Coran Bay, Lorna walked out onto the flats at low water in a pair of borrowed rubber boots with a hand compass and a notebook and spent 2 hours taking bearings on everything that stuck up out of the mud and came back with a page of numbers in pencil, and Master Sergeant Gil Prosser watched her scrape her boots at the gate and said, loud, to 3 other men, "Beachcombing." There was a folded page in the back of that notebook that she had carried for 2 years. It was a memorandum, 1 paragraph, from a warrant officer named Simon Peake, who did imagery for a task force she wasn't in anymore. It said, in the flat language those things use, that the assessment of the vehicle in question on the night in question was consistent with the ground shooter's read, and that in his professional judgment the shooter's refusal to engage had been correct. It was dated 4 days after the board convened. It had never been entered into anything. Peake had printed it, put it in an envelope, and handed it to her in a parking lot in the rain, and said, "You appeal, I'll come. You don't even have to ask nice. Just ask." The board had used the phrase unreliable under time pressure. 3 words on a page in a building she would never see again, and they went with her everywhere into every unit, ahead of her, the way weather gets somewhere before you do. She had never appealed. There was a window, and the window had a date on it, and she had let the date go by twice, because appealing meant saying out loud that she thought they were wrong, and some cold, flat part of her had never been completely certain they were. She had been right about the vehicle. She had also been slow. Both of those were true, and she had never worked out which one the paper was really about. So she kept Peake's page folded in the back of a notebook and used the notebook for range cards, and every so often, sorting gear, her thumb would find the soft worn crease of it, and she'd put the notebook down and go do something else. The chow tent at Coran Bay was run by a woman named Marion Osgood, who was 51 and local, and had cooked for a container line before the container line left, and who had opinions about everyone on that bluff which she kept behind her teeth like coins. Prosser did his cruelty in the chow line, which is where men do it, because there's an audience and a line and nobody can leave. "Here's the thing," he said, not to Lorna, about Lorna, over a tray. "You give a lane to a guy, you know what he does under it. I know what Latham does under a lane. I've bled with Latham." He let it sit. "I don't run people I haven't bled with, nothing personal. It's just not a thing you can read off a piece of paper." "I wouldn't read it off the paper," Lorna said. "The paper's boring." A couple of them laughed and then stopped laughing because Prosser hadn't, and she took her tray and sat down at the end and ate her food, and that was that. 2 days later there was a bet running on number 3 piling. The piling stood off the old ferry ramp in a row, and the water came up them, and somebody had painted a band on the 3rd one about a decade ago, and the ongoing wager among the sentries was what minute the flood would touch the band. Money changed hands weekly. A sergeant named Hoyle held the book. "Hey, augmentee," Hoyle called, entirely without malice, which was its own kind of thing. "You're the beachcomber. What time's it touch?" Lorna didn't even look at her watch. She looked at the water for maybe 4 seconds, at the way the sheen ran up the flat between 2 ridges, and said, 6:19, 6:20 if that squall to the west drops the wind out. "You want in?" "Sure. Put me for 6:19. It touched the band at 6:19 and 40 seconds, and there was an actual shout, and Hoyle counted $11 into her hand with the expression of a man watching his own house get repossessed, and Lorna walked it straight over to Marion's tent and bought the last 11 cold drinks in the cooler and set them on the sandbags by the gate and walked away without saying anything. Hoyle drank one. So did 4 other people. Prosser, coming off the ramp 40 minutes later, found one sweating on a post with nobody near it and stood there a while before he took it. She was easy to be around. That was the confusing part. She had a dry mouth on her. When a generator wouldn't start, she told them it was sulking and needed to be spoken to in its own language. And then she cleaned a jet, and it started. And when Boland's team argued for 20 minutes about the correct name for a bird on the wire, she listened to the whole thing and then said, "That's a pigeon." And Boland laughed so hard he had to sit down on a crate. And she and Boland found each other the way people in a trade do, overwork. They were laying out a hide kit on a tarp behind the ammo point, and Boland was checking a spotting scope, and Lorna was doing something with a length of parachute cord and a folded grain sack she'd cadged out of the salt store, filling it, tamping it, working the fill down into the corners with the heel of her hand. "That's salt," Boland said. Sand's easier. Sand's heavier and it goes to soup when it's wet," Lorna said. "Salt packs harder, and this whole harbor's got a building full of it that nobody's counted since 1994. He watched her hands. She tied the neck of the sack off with 2 turns and a hitch that took about a second and a half and would not come loose in a hurricane. "Where'd you learn that hitch?" "Boat." "Whose boat?" "My mother's," she said. And then, because he'd asked like a person, she hated boats. She just happened to own one. Boland grinned and went back to the scope, and something in the shape of the afternoon had changed, and neither of them said anything about it. The squall came through on the Thursday, off the sea, 40 knots of it, and the chow tent's windward awning started walking. The guy line had pulled its stake, and the pole was tracking sideways in a way that meant in about 90 seconds, 120 pounds of aluminum was going to come down across the serving table. Marion Osgood saw 4 men get up. She saw them start doing what men do, which is grab the nearest part of the problem. She also saw the new one cross the tent floor without hurrying. Lorna went past all of them, kicked the loose stake flat with the side of her boot, took 2 turns of the line around it, dropped a hitch on, and then, before anyone had touched the pole, reached up and unclipped the leeward flap so the wind had somewhere to go. The whole tent sighed and stopped fighting. It took about 20 seconds. She hadn't pulled on anything. She had not, as far as Marion could tell, used any strength at all. Then she picked up a fallen ladle, wiped it on her sleeve, put it back in the pot, and went and sat down. Marion stood there with her hands in a dish towel. She had watched men work all her life, dockmen, boatmen, men with 50 years in their shoulders, and she could not have told you what she had just seen or why it sat in her chest like that. Later, when her sister asked her about the American girl, all Marion could get out was, "She didn't fix it, she just put her hand where it was pulling." Her sister said that made no sense. "I know," Marion said. "It made sense while she was doing it." The world broke in on a Wednesday at 10 past 11 in the morning, in daylight, in front of everybody, and it did not come as a radio call. It came as a sound the harbor had never made. A single flat crack down at the fuel farm, and then a horn, the weighbridge horn, the one they leaned on when a truck was cleared, held down, 4 seconds, 6, 8, and then that stopped too, and then nothing. Lieutenant Colonel Dean Hatcher was on the bluff with a coffee in his hand when he saw the men on the fuel farm apron start running the wrong way, in from the water instead of toward the gate, and he saw the first vehicle come through the seaward fence, and then a second, and he said quietly, "Oh no." 2 trucks and a skiff. They came in off the coast road and up out of the water at the same minute, which meant somebody had read a tide table, and inside 90 seconds they had the pump house and the weighbridge shed and the whole apron, and they were shooting into the air to move people, and the 16 port workers on the morning shift were being pushed into a concrete building with 1 door. 16. That was the number Hatcher put on the net, and that was the number that stayed. 16 people who came to work. 14 of them made it into the pump house. Amos Rankin, 58 years old, crane operator, 3 weeks and 2 days from his last shift, went over the seaward rail instead and dropped 8 feet onto the flats and started running out across the mud, which every man on the bluff watching through glass thought was the stupidest thing he had ever seen, and which was the only correct decision available. And Owen Trace, a fuel gauger who was deaf in his right ear from 22 years of pumps, went the other way along the seawall and vanished, and nobody saw where. They shot Amos Rankin in the leg at 400 meters, and he went down in the open with the water a mile away and coming. 16 souls, Hatcher said into the net. 14 in the pump house, 1 down on the flats, 1 unaccounted. Nobody's coming home in a bag today. Get me options. The options were bad and got worse in about 40 minutes. 2 aircraft were the plan, and the sea took them. A squall line stacked up on the west horizon and lay down over the estuary at 300 feet with rain in it, and the birds went unable. And everyone in that tent watched a man on a radio say the word unable and understood that the plan had just become a walk. The unit's own sniper section was 90 kilometers north with the main effort and would not be back before dark, which left the flats. Hatcher stood over the map with the harbormaster's chart under his hand and said, "Somebody tell me why we can't just come down the road." "Because the road's got 200 meters of open apron at the end of it and they're sitting on it," Prosser said. "We come down the road, we lose people at the gate, and they start shooting the pump house. Then it's the flats. It's the flats at low water, and it's 8 minutes in the open." And Hatcher looked around the tent, at all the faces, and then at the woman standing at the back who had not said one word in 20 minutes, and he did the thing he would have to own later in front of people. "Tolliver, sir, I read your file when you came." He said it straight at her, in front of 9 men. "I read 3 words in it, and I believed them, and I put you on the roster for the shift I thought couldn't hurt anybody. That was mine. That was me being lazy with a person." He put a finger on the chart, on the salt house. "There's nobody else. Can you cover that lane?" "Yes, sir." "Say more than that." "I need to be on the salt house roof by 2, Lorna said. "I need Boland and Shaw, and I need Master Sergeant Prosser to step off at the minute I give him, not the minute the tide book gives him, and he's going to hate that." Prosser's jaw moved. "That's it?" Hatcher said. "No, sir. There's a gun I can't see yet, and I want to go find it before I have to." 4 minutes later, she was on the net for the first time in her life in front of that unit, and every man in the ops tent looked up at the sound of it, because the voice that came out of the speaker was not the voice of the person they had decided she was. It was flat and slow, and it had no edges on it at all. "Bluff, Tolliver. Moving to the salt house. 200 meters of dead ground on my route from the culvert. I'll be off the net for 90 seconds. Nobody shoot at the north wall. I'll be on it." Somebody in the corner said, "Huh." The salt house had a flat roof of tarred tin and a parapet a foot high, and it had been the highest thing on that shoreline since 1911, and it smelled inside like a mineral hospital. Lorna and Boland and Corporal Emmett Shaw came into it through the landward door at 1:10 with rain coming sideways, and Shaw, who was 24 and had a face like an open window, said what everyone on the bluff had been thinking. "Ma'am, how are you going to cover 8 minutes of open flat by yourself? There's got to be a dozen of them over there." 11, Lorna said. "You counted them?" "I've been counting them for 2 hours. She was unrolling the mat. "There's 11 positions that can put fire onto that lane. If there's a 12th, he's asleep in a truck, and if he wakes up, we'll have a different conversation." The rain quit at 2, and the sky went that scoured, washed color it gets after, and the light came out low and yellow from the west, and the tide started to go, and Lorna Tolliver got to work. Here is what work looked like. She lay down. She got the rifle onto the salt sack and the sack onto the parapet and got behind it, and did not move for 11 minutes while Boland read her numbers, and she wrote a card in pencil, and every line on it was a bearing and a range and a description in 3 words. Crane cab, 540. Terminal roof north, 610, 2 of them. Tank 3 catwalk, 720. Weighbridge sandbags, 660. Seawall stairhead, 480. Truck park rover, 700, has a tube. Pump house breezeway, 690, 2. Skiff at the ramp, 730. That was 10. "And the 11th, Boland said. "The 11th is why we're going to have a bad afternoon." She had been listening to it since noon. Twice, when the port workers had been moved across the apron, someone in the Delphine's car deck had fired a short burst over their heads to hurry them, and the sound had come out of that hull like a hammer in a drum, and Lorna had rolled 6 inches left and right and up onto the parapet and looked at every line into that ship and found exactly none. The Delphine had run herself onto the flats years ago and been half cut for scrap and then left. She lay bow on to the crossing lane with her bow visor up and her vehicle ramp down in the mud, and the gap between the lip of that ramp and the deck plating behind it was a slot about knee-high and 20 feet wide, and it pointed straight down the lane like a letterbox with a machine gun behind it. The gunner was well back on the car deck, in the dark 20 meters inside a steel box. From the salt house, from the crane, from the bluff, from every place a human being could stand on land, the hull's own flare covered that slot. You could see the ship, you could not see into her. "How much of the lane does he own?" Boland asked. "All of it," said Lorna. Shaw went out to the north end at 2:30 to watch the coast road, because if a third truck came down it while they were committed, everything ended. He went with a radio and a set of glasses and a candy bar, and he said, "Back in 20, and Lorna said, "Don't be a hero, just be a person with eyes." And he laughed and went. At 3:15 she called him, "Shaw, Tolliver." Nothing. Static has a texture. It sits there and hisses, and you can hear the shape of the space it's coming from. And when a person is about to key up, you can hear that too, a tiny suck before the voice. "Shaw, Tolliver, radio check." Nothing. She counted. 10 seconds. 20. She keyed again and heard her own voice go out and heard it stop, and behind her eyes she was suddenly in a fluorescent room 2 years ago with a ceiling light that hummed at a pitch that made your teeth hurt. 3 officers behind a table, and she was saying, "I called it as I saw it," and one of them was writing without looking up. That was the memory that came right then, uninvited, exactly the least useful thing in the world. "Shaw, 40 seconds. Boland, go get him." "I go. You're alone up here." "I'm going to be alone up here at 4 anyway." "Go." Boland went. 90 seconds of Lorna Tolliver on a roof with her heart going like a bird in a box, breathing to a count of 12 because that was the only trick she had ever found that worked, keeping the crosshair on the crane cab because if she moved it, she would start looking at the north end, and she could not afford to look at the north end. At 3:22, the radio said, "Got him! He's alive!" Then, half a minute later, Boland again, tight. Piece of roof gutter came off in that squall and caught him. He's got a scalp laid open and he can't hear out of the left. He's talking. He's mad about the candy bar. Lorna breathed out. "Tell him he still owes me 20 minutes. Amos Rankin had been lying in the mud for 4.5 hours. She had watched him through glass the whole time. He had done everything right, which is to say he had crawled 30 meters into a shallow gut in the sand and then stopped moving, and the men on the apron had lost interest in him because a man lying still on a mile of mud is not interesting. But the water was going, and the water was coming back, and the gut he was lying in would be the first thing to fill. At 3:40, she rolled off the mat. "Where are you going?" Boland said, coming back through the hatch with blood on his sleeve that wasn't his. 210 meters, out and back. "Tolliver." "He's in the gut. When the flood turns, that gut runs before the flat does. He'll be in 8 inches of water, and he can't sit up, and 8 inches is plenty." She was already taking her belt kit off and leaving the rifle on the sack. "Hold my lane." "With what?" "With your eyes. If anything moves on the terminal roof, you tell me, and I'll lie down in the mud and be a rock." Going out onto that flat in daylight was the worst 200 meters of her life to that point. The sand was ribbed and hard, and it was the color of wet cardboard, and she was the only vertical thing on it. She went at a crouch for 40 meters and then flat, and after that it was elbows and toes, and the mud came up her front and into her collar, and it smelled of iron and rot. 600 meters away, a man on the terminal roof stood up and stretched, and put his hands on the parapet, and looked out over the water. And Lorna put her face down in the sand and lay perfectly still, with her heart hammering into the ground, and counted. 12 in, 12 out. Her thigh cramped and she let it cramp. A gull came and stood 4 feet from her head and screamed at her for 90 seconds, which she was certain, absolutely certain, was going to be what killed her. The man on the roof spat over the side and sat back down. She covered the last 60 meters in the gut with water already sliding along it in a thin sheet, and got a hand on Amos Rankin's shoulder, and he came up swinging. "Easy, easy. I'm American. I'm with the unit on the bluff. My name's Lorna." He was gray in the face, and his lips were cracked white with salt. "My leg." "I know. I'm going to look at it, and then we're going to move about 30 meters, and then I'm going to fix it properly. Can you take 30 meters? "I can take 30 meters. He took 40 on his belly, with her dragging his collar and his own hands clawing the sand, and they got behind the low stone stub where the mole met the shore, and she got him into the lee of it and out of every line on that apron. And then she did the close work. She cut the trouser leg with a hooked blade and put a dressing on and packed it and got the strap on above it and turned the windlass and watched his face. She talked the whole time, low, the way you talk to something that might bolt. My mother dug clams. That's how I know you're flats. She had a launch that leaked from a place she could never find, and she used to say it was leaking on principle. You're the beachcomber, Amos said. Word gets around. Everybody in the port knows who walks the mole at low water, he hissed as she snugged the strap. Only 2 of us do it. Who's the other? Owen Trace. He grabbed her wrist. Owen went in the ferry. When they came off the trucks, he went along the wall and into the Delphine, into the bottom. There's a hatch off the car deck, goes down to the flat under it. He hid in there when he was a boy, and now he's 40, and I don't think he ever forgot it. His hand was shaking. He can't hear on the right side. You shout at him, and he'll never know you're shouting. Lorna looked out at the hulk with the sun getting lower behind it. Am I going to die out here? Amos said. Say it straight. My wife's name is Nell, and she is at home right now, and she has not been told anything. You're not going to die out here, Lorna said. You've got a hole in the outside of your thigh, and it missed everything that matters, and you've been out in the sun for 5 hours, so you're going to feel awful, and you're going to be fine. That's a fact, not a hope. I don't hand out hopes. He shut his eyes. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks left, and then I'm done with that crane. What are you going to do? You'll laugh. Try me. I'm learning to swim, Amos Rankin said. 6 in the morning at the pool in town, 3 mornings a week, and I pay the man extra to open early so nobody sees me. 58 years old, 40 years working over water. He opened his eyes, and they were wet and furious. I go up in that crane every day over a harbor, and if I fell in it, I would go down like a bag of chain. Nell doesn't know. Nobody knows. I wanted to just, one day, walk in the water with her and not stand where I could touch. Lorna finished the knot and put his hand on the strap. Then we're going to get you back to your 6 o'clock lesson, she said. At 4:11, Master Sergeant Gil Prosser lay in the reeds at the line of departure with 11 men behind him and made the call that cost him something he never got back. He had watched the aircraft go unable. He had watched his own plan turn into a walk. He had 100 meters of reeds and then 600 meters of nothing, and somewhere out there was a hull with a gun in it that his best observer could not find a line into, and the only overwatch on this coast was a woman he had said a thing about in a chow line 4 days ago in front of people who would remember it for the rest of their lives. The silence before he keyed the handset lasted 6 seconds. Every man in the ops tent heard it, because he'd opened the mic and then not spoken, and there is no sound in the world louder than a man breathing on an open net. Bluff, this is Prosser. Another second. Put Tolliver on. I want her voice, not a relay. Tolliver, I've got 11 men, and I'm about to walk them across a mile of nothing. Before I do that, I need to hear you say you can hold that lane, and I need you to know that if you can't, I'd rather you told me right now, in front of God and the Colonel and everybody. I can hold it for 8 minutes, Lorna said. I can't hold it for 9. Step off at 4:26, not before. If you're early, you'll be in soft mud at the gut, and you'll add 4 minutes, and I will not have 4 minutes for you. And the ship. If the ship opens up, everybody goes flat and stays flat, and nobody tries to be brave, and I'll be off this roof and gone. Don't call me. I won't answer. It'll take me 4 minutes, and then it won't be a problem anymore. Hatcher's voice came in quiet. Explain that to me, Tolliver, slow, so I understand what I'm approving. So she explained it, slow, on an open net, while a dozen men leaned in around a radio, and 110 kilometers away, nobody could hear any of it. That gap under the ferry's ramp is about knee-high, and it faces down the lane. From the land side, you're looking at the curve of her hull, so you never get an angle in. There's exactly one bearing that opens the slot, and it's 238 high southwest, and it runs right down the old stone mole. The mole's underwater, Prosser said. Most of it is, not the outer 60 meters. They dumped rock on the end of it when they repaired the head in the 80s, and the end stands about 2 feet proud of the rest, so it comes out of the water first, and it goes under last. The middle stays covered. It'll be shin deep across the middle at 4:20. I've walked it twice. That's why you were beachcombing, Boland said, off the net to nobody. Book says low at 438, Lorna went on. The book's for the channel gauge a mile up. Out on the head it's low at 431, and the end of that mole is standing dry from about 412 to about 504. That's my window for the ground. And you can see inside a dark car deck. How exactly? Hatcher said. Because of the hour, sir. That same bearing, 238, is where the sun is at 20 past 4 this week. It comes down the slot with me. For about 12 minutes it lights the back bulkhead of that car deck like a slide projector. I'm not going to be looking into a dark hole. I'm going to be looking at a lit wall with a man standing in front of it. Silence on the net. 640 meters, she said. Wet stone, no purchase for a bipod, and the head's greasy with weed, which is what the salt sack is for. And the window is the window. The sun's off that bearing by 1/2 and the water's over the head by 5, and after that nobody on this earth can touch that gun until tomorrow afternoon. Prosser's voice came back low and strange. You worked all that out beachcombing. I worked it out on day 3, Lorna said. I just didn't know what I'd need it for. At 4:26 exactly, 12 men came out of the reeds and started walking. Boland said, 8 minutes, and started his watch. Lorna took the terminal roof first, both of them 610 meters, because they were the highest and the first to see. The first man was standing. The second man had time to turn his head toward the sound, and that was all the time he had. 11 seconds between them. 2, said Boland. The crane cab was 540, and it was glass on 3 sides, and the man in it was already coming up out of the seat. She took him through the cab, and the glass went white and sagged. 7.5 minutes. The stairhead at 480 was the closest thing on the card, and he was moving, running along the top of the seawall toward a better view of the lane, and she led him, and the round went where he was going to be. 7 minutes. Down on the flat, 12 men were walking fast in a loose file with 200 meters behind them, and they heard the shots as flat, distant taps behind their left shoulders and nothing at all coming back the other way. And Prosser afterward said the strangest thing about that walk was how quiet it was for them. Somewhere behind them, a woman was taking a harbor apart one window at a time, and all they heard was their own breathing and the suck of their boots. The Weybridge sandbags at 660 took her 2 rounds. The first was low, and she felt it go before it landed, and she was already correcting. 6 minutes. Tank 3 catwalk, 7:20. A man lying prone on grating with a long gun, which was the one she'd been most afraid of, and she had been watching that catwalk for 4 hours, and she knew that the third stanchion from the ladder had a gap in the kick plate exactly wide enough. 5.5. The rover in the truck park had the tube on his shoulder and was turning toward the lane, and she took him at 700 with a windhold she'd built out of the way the flag on the fuel farm gate was standing, and the tube went off into the mud 100 meters from anybody and made a lot of noise and no difference. 5 minutes. Tolliver, they're at the halfway. 2 in the pump house breezeway. She had been dreading these because they were closest to the doorway with 14 people behind it. One came out and stood clear of the frame, and she took him. The other one stayed in the doorway, and she waited. 4 seconds. 6. 8 seconds of a woman with her finger straight along the guard while 12 men walked in the open and a clock ran. He leaned out. 9. 4 minutes. The skiff at the ramp, 7:30, a man crouched behind the outboard, and she put one through the cowling, and he ran, and she let him run, because he was running away from the lane, and then he turned to come back, and she stopped him. 10, Boland said, and his voice cracked in the middle of it. 3.5 minutes. And then the hull woke up. It came out of the Delphine like a hammer inside a drum, that flat metallic bark with the ship's own steel doubling it, and the flat in front of Prosser's file jumped in a long, ragged line, and 12 men went down in the mud so fast they looked like they'd been swept. "Contact ship! Contact ship! Everybody flat!" Prosser shouted. "Nobody moves, do not get up." Lorna Tolliver was already off the mat. She did not answer the net. She took the salt sack under her left arm and the rifle in her right hand, and went down the salt house ladder in about 4 seconds with her boots on the outside of the rails and out the landward door and along the stub and onto the stone. Boland got to the parapet in time to see her go and said, into the handset, in a voice the whole task force heard, "She's off the roof. She's on the mole. She's in the water." 3 minutes. The mole was Victorian granite laid in courses, and every course of it was slick with green weed, and the middle section was covered, and the water was not deep, but it was moving, running along the stone in a fast, shallow sheet toward the harbor, and it pulled at her ankles and then her shins, and it was full of grit that got into her boots immediately. She went along it fast with her feet turned out, weight on the outside edges, the way you walk on a wet ledge, and she did not look at the ship, and she did not look at the sun, and she counted stones, because her mother had told her once that panic is just arithmetic you refuse to do. 80 meters of that, in the open, in full view of an apron where, as far as she knew, there might still be a 12th man asleep in a truck. Halfway along, a spent burst from the ship came skipping across the water 200 meters to her right, a line of little white flowers opening on the surface, and she did not stop and she did not go flat, because going flat in 8 inches of moving water on greasy stone was how you drowned face down in a puddle in front of an entire task force. The high ground's out, not in. She said it out loud with the water going past her ankles. The high ground's out, not in. The head of the mole came up under her boots exactly where she had known it would, dry granite 2 feet proud, warm from the sun, ringed with black weed and small crabs going sideways. She dropped the salt sack on the stone, and it went down with a solid smack and settled, and she was behind the rifle before the sack had stopped moving. 2 minutes. She got low and got her bearing, and there it was. She had been right. That is the thing she remembered afterward, more than anything else in that whole afternoon. The pure animal relief of being right about a piece of water and a piece of light. The low sun came over her left shoulder and ran flat down the axis of the slot and lit the inside of the Delphine's car deck the color of weak tea, and the back bulkhead glowed, and standing against it, 20 meters inside the ship with his shoulders hunched and his elbows out over the gun, was the shape of a man, 640 meters. The slot was 2 feet of daylight, and he was in the middle of it. Wind from her left, off the sea, honest and steady, the kind of wind you can hold for. Her heart was going and her breathing was wrecked from the run and the wade, and she made herself lie there and do nothing for 11 seconds while it came down, which is the hardest thing anybody ever does. And behind her, the harbor was full of noise, and the drum kept hammering, and 12 men lay on their faces in the mud with their arms over their heads. The gun in the ship walked its fire left, looking for someone to hit. Lorna Tolliver breathed out, and the world went quiet the way it always did for her at the end, that little pocket of silence with nothing in it, and she pressed. The sound went out over the water and came back off the hull. And then nothing happened. That's the thing nobody tells you. At 640 meters, there is a piece of a second where the world hasn't caught up yet, and it is the longest piece of time there is, and she lay on wet granite with a sack of salt under her rifle and watched a lit rectangle in the side of a dead ship and did not breathe. The shape against the bulkhead came apart from the gun and went down. The hammering stopped. Out on the flat, 12 men lay in the mud in a silence so total that Prosser could hear the water starting to come back over the mussel bed a mile out, that far-off frying sound, and he lifted his head out of the sand, and then he got up onto his knees, and then he stood all the way up in the open, which he could not have told you why he did. Lorna keyed the handset. 11. Lane's clear. You've got 3 minutes and 40 seconds of walking left, Master Sergeant, and I'd use it. Boland, on the salt house roof, looked at the watch in his hand and could not make his eyes work for a second. 8 minutes exactly. From the first man on the terminal roof to the last man in the ship. 8 minutes and no seconds, and he swore to that number to an investigator 11 days later with his hand up. They came off the flats at 4:35 and hit the apron, and it was over in 90 seconds, because there was nobody left on that fuel farm who could stop 12 angry men, and the pump house door came off its hinges, and 14 port workers came out into the low sun with their hands on their heads and then their hands over their faces. Nobody was on the mole. Prosser got a man up on the seawall with glasses, and the man said, "Sir, there's nobody out there." and Prosser looked out at the harbor, and the mole was a gray line with the water already back over the middle of it, and no woman on the head of it, and no rifle either, and he felt something go through him that he did not have a word for. She had gone into the ship. She had put the rifle down on the head of the mole in its case, taken the coil of 8mm line she had been carrying under her smock since 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and gone off the seaward side into the water and waded and then swum the last of the gut and come up under the Delphine's ramp with the tide coming in behind her. Because a man named Amos Rankin had told her about a hatch off the car deck that went down into the flat under it, and about a 40-year-old fuel gauger who hid in it when he was a boy, and about how you could shout at Owen Trace all day long and he would never once know you were shouting. The car deck was dark and stinking and about 30 degrees off level, and there was water coming in through the ramp gap in a wide sheet with each set of the flood. She went past the gun without looking at it. She found the hatch aft on the low side, a round steel plate with a wheel, and the wheel was hard over, and around the coaming there was water standing 18 inches deep, because that was the low side of a ship lying on her port bilge. She got down in it and put her ear on the steel. Under the noise of the water she heard, very faint, something rapping. 3, 3, 3. She hammered on the plate with the heel of her hand, and the rapping stopped, and then started again, faster. The wheel would not turn. It had been shut from the inside by a frightened man who had put his whole body into it 4 hours ago, and it had a strong back bar that had dropped across it, and the water was coming up the coaming while she worked. She got the line onto a spoke and the other end onto a lashing eye in the deck and put a trucker's hitch in it and hauled, and the wheel moved a quarter turn and stopped. And she went into the water up to her armpits and got her hand around the strong back and lifted it out of its socket, and the whole thing came free at once, and the hatch went up and slammed against the deck, and Owen Trace came up out of that hole with the water running off him like a man coming up out of a grave. He was shaking so hard he could not stand. He was looking at her face and not understanding any of it, and she pointed at her own left ear and then at his good side and got around to it and put her mouth close. "Owen, I'm taking you out. Hold my belt and don't let go. And when I go under the ramp lip, you go under too, and you come up on the other side, and there's 100 men out there." "Who are you?" "I'm nobody. I'm the beachcomber. Come on." They came out from under the Delphine's ramp into the last of the sunlight at 4:51 in the afternoon, in water to their chests, with the flood running past them, and the whole apron of the fuel farm packed with people, and a sergeant on the seawall started shouting and pointing, and then everybody was shouting, and Gil Prosser came down off the wall and out into the water in his boots and his plates, and took Owen Trace's other arm without saying one word. Lorna reported it in the flattest language available to her. "Bluff, Tolliver. 11 engaged, 11 down. Lane's clear. I've got the 16th. He's cold, and he's scared, and he's got no injuries I can see. 16 for 16. I need somebody to walk out to the head of the mole in the next 4 minutes. There's a rifle and a sack of salt on it, and I'd like them both back." Hatcher took his hand off the map table and put it flat on the top of the radio, and did not speak for a while. Boland said, into the roof of the salt house, to nobody at all, "Somebody go get her gun." She got up the seawall ladder under her own power and sat down on a bollard with her boots in a puddle, and somebody put a blanket around her, and she said thank you, and then she looked down at her own hands, and they were going like leaves. She watched them do it with a kind of distant professional interest. Her whole body had waited very politely until it was finished, and now it was presenting the bill. Her legs were shaking. Her teeth were going. The inside of her nose was full of the smell of that car deck, rust and diesel and standing salt water and something underneath it like old vegetables, and she could not get it out, and she would be able to summon that smell perfectly at will for the rest of her life. 20 feet away, a medic was cutting Amos Rankin's boot off, and Amos was fighting him about it. Somebody was counting heads out loud, going along the line of port workers with a finger. 14, 15, 16, 16, that's everybody. That's everybody. Emmett Shaw came along the wall with a field dressing wrapped around his head like a bad turban, and sat down on the concrete next to her boots, and did not say anything for a minute. "I missed it," he said finally. Too loud, the way people talk when half their hearing is gone. You didn't miss much. They're saying 11. Then it was 11. He put his head back against the wall. Ma'am, I have to tell you something, and then I'm going to go be sick. When I came out of that unit at the start, I honestly thought you were somebody's cousin, like somebody made a phone call and you got a slot. He laughed and stopped because laughing hurt. I want to be a better person about that, and I don't know how to start. Start by not shouting, Lorna said. I'm right here. Major Harlan Beck arrived on the 4th day from a joint investigation cell 400 miles away, and he was not a villain and never became one, and that was what made it worth watching. He was a careful man with a clipboard and reading glasses and 18 years of doing exactly this, and he sat down across a folding table from Lorna Tolliver in a plywood room with an air conditioner that dripped, and he had 2 documents in front of him, and they did not describe the same person. Sergeant, I want to be straight with you about why I'm here. There's a record of 11 engagements by a single shooter inside an 8-minute period, an unauthorized individual movement to an off-plan firing position, and an unaccompanied entry into a wrecked vessel. He tapped the second folder. And there's a board finding from 2 years ago that uses the phrase unreliable under time pressure. Those 2 things don't sit next to each other. One of them is wrong. Help me. Which one do you want to be wrong, sir? I want neither of them to be wrong. That's not how paper works. He put his glasses on. Walk me through the mole. So she did. The bearing. The rock dumped on the head in the 80s. The book's low water versus the head's low water and the 7 minutes between them. The sun on 238 and the lit bulkhead and the 12-minute overlap. Beck wrote it all down and then stopped writing. You're telling me you knew about this angle on your 3rd day here. Day 3, sir. It's in the notebook. Boland's got it. Because you happen to be walking on a breakwater. Because I don't know a harbor until I've walked it at low water, Lorna said. That's not a philosophy, sir. That's what my mother did before she took a boat anywhere. Beck looked at his notes for a while. There's a problem with your timeline, he said. Boland reports you off the roof and into the water at 4:31. Prosser reports the ship's gun stopped at 4:34. That's 3 minutes to cover 240 meters, 80 of it waiting, plus set up and shoot at 640. I've got people telling me that's not physically possible and that the timeline's been tidied up to protect somebody. Then get somebody to walk it, sir. I intend to. The thing about Harlan Beck is that he did intend to, and the thing about Gil Prosser is that he went first. He did it at 4 in the morning, 3 days later, in the dark, alone, without telling anybody, because low water that day was at 4:11 a.m., and a man who wants to know something goes when the water is where it needs to be, not when it's convenient. He put on a headlamp and a pair of borrowed rubber boots, and he walked out along the mole in 8 inches of running water, and fell twice on the weed, and put his hand down on a crab and swore loudly enough to wake the sentries, and he stood on the head of it with the harbor lights out behind him, and looked back at the Delphine's black shape and understood, all at once and completely, what she had seen from there. Then he walked back and timed it, and then he did it again, twice, and got a stopwatch number and wrote it on a page of his notebook in the dark, with mud on his hands. He handed it to Beck at breakfast without a word, covered to the elbows, and went and sat by himself. 2 nights after that, Lorna Tolliver and Wyatt Boland sat on the seaside of the Salt House at 1:30 in the morning with a bag of Marion's cold rolls between them and the water somewhere down at the bottom of its range, hissing on the mud. I've got a question, Boland said, and you can tell me to go to hell. Go on. When you went off that roof, you didn't answer the net. Prosser called your name 4 times. Hatcher called you. I called you. You had a handset on your chest the whole way out, and you never keyed it. Lorna turned a rollover in her fingers. Because if I'd keyed it, one of you would have told me not to go. Yeah, and I'd have had to decide whether to listen. And that decision takes about 4 seconds, and I did not have 4 seconds. She set the roll down. That's not the reason, though. Boland waited. Out on the flats, a bird made a sound like a rusty gate. 2 years ago, I had a truck in my scope and a man on a radio telling me to shoot it, and I said no, 3 times. I said no 3 times, and I was right. There were 9 people in the back of it who had no business being in anybody's war. And then a different element got hit on a different axis 11 minutes later, and afterward a board sat down and worked out that 11 minutes was my 11 minutes. Her voice did not change at all. They wrote that I was unreliable under time pressure. And Wyatt, I have never, not once, not one single time in 2 years, been sure they were wrong. That's insane. Is it? I was slow. That's a fact. I was right and I was slow. And I have never been able to put those 2 things in the same sentence in a way that comes out clean. She looked at her hands. So when that gun opened up on the ship, I did not want to be on a radio. I did not want anybody's voice in my ear asking me to justify anything, because I know what I do when somebody asks me to justify something. I stop. I go careful. I take 11 minutes. She stopped. I went off that roof so nobody could ask me a question. The wind came off the water. Somewhere down on the apron, a generator changed note. Boland let the silence sit for a good 10 seconds before he touched it. You want the truth, or you want me to be nice? Truth. You weren't slow 2 years ago. You were the only person in that whole system doing their actual job. He said it flat, like reading a number off a gauge. A man on a radio wanted a thing to be simple, and you were the one human being in the chain looking at it, and you told him no. And being told no is the most expensive thing that happens to people like that, so they made it about you. That's not a theory. I've been in 11 years, I've watched it happen 4 times, and it works because the person it happens to always ends up doing exactly what you're doing right now. What am I doing right now? Agreeing with them, Boland said. Quietly, in the dark, where nobody can argue with you about it. Lorna Tolliver did not say anything for a long moment. The tide hissed. That's a hell of a thing to say to somebody at 1 a.m. You asked for the truth. Eat your roll. Beck found her on the 7th day at the ammo point with the paperwork half done, and he did not sit down, and he did not soften it. I'm closing my file with a finding of appropriate conduct across the board, including the individual movement, which I'm characterizing as within the ground commander's intent, which is generous of me and also true. He handed her a folder. That's yours. Now I'm going to say a thing that isn't in my remit, and then I'm going to leave. Sir, I pulled the old board because I had to. Standard. He took his glasses off. Sergeant, there is a memorandum in that file. It's stapled at the back with the correspondence that came in after the finding and was never adjudicated. It's from a Chief Warrant Officer, Simon Peake, and it is 1 paragraph long, and it says the shooter's read was correct, and that in his professional judgment, the refusal to engage was the right call. It was received 9 days after the board closed. Nobody actioned it because nobody had to. A finding that isn't appealed doesn't get looked at again. That's not a conspiracy. That's a filing system. Lorna stood there with the folder in her hands. I have a copy of that memo, she said. He gave it to me in a parking lot. Then you've had the whole thing for 2 years. Yes, sir. Beck put his glasses in his shirt pocket. Correction of a record isn't a favor, and it isn't a reopening of the incident. It's an administrative process, and it needs 3 things: the finding, a statement from a witness with relevant expertise, and a person willing to sign her name at the bottom of a page saying she wants it looked at. He picked up his bag. The first 2 exist. The third is entirely up to you, and I'm not going to tell you to do it, because I've watched a lot of people get talked into things, and they mostly quit halfway. Good luck, Sergeant. She sat in the back of the chow tent that night for 2 hours with a blank form and a pen, and Marion Osgood brought her a coffee and took the empty one away and did not ask. The thing that stopped her was not fear, exactly. It was that filling in that form was a sentence. It said, out loud in her own handwriting, in the box marked basis for request, the finding is not supported by the evidence. And to write that she had to actually believe it. And believing it meant a room with a humming light and 3 officers had been wrong about her. And it is a strange, ugly fact about people that this is sometimes harder to hold in your head than being wrong yourself. If they were wrong, then 2 years of taking it had been for nothing. If they were right, at least the 2 years made sense. She thought about the mole. She thought about lying on wet granite with her heart coming down, and the tea-colored light in the slot, and the pure, clean animal certainty of it. I was right about the water. I was right about the light. I was right on day 3, and I have been right the whole time." She wrote the sentence. Then she picked up the sat phone and dialed a number she had known by heart for 2 years and never once used, and it rang 4 times, and a voice she had not heard since a rainy parking lot said, "Peak, Chief, it's Lorna Tolliver." There was a pause on the line that went on so long she thought she'd lost the link. "Tolliver," Peak said. His voice had gone somewhere. "Sergeant, I have a green folder on the shelf over my desk with your name on the tab, and I have moved it 4 times. To 3 duty stations, and my wife thinks I'm out of my mind. I need a witness statement." "You need a witness statement," Peak repeated slowly. 2 years. You needed one 2 years ago, and I told you all you had to do was ask, and I've been sitting here." He stopped himself. He breathed. When he came back, his voice was steady and very kind, and that was worse. "Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Give me the case number and the address, and I'll have it notarized and in the mail by Thursday, and then I'm going to call you back in a week and ask how you are, and you're going to actually answer." "Chief, don't apologize. Just don't do it again. Give me the number." Gil Prosser came to find her 4 days later in the evening in the ammo point with the light going orange through the door, and she was cleaning the rifle with the parts laid out on a towel, and he stood in the doorway until she looked up. "That your salt sack?" "That's the one. Boland says you're going to have it bronzed." "Boland's an idiot." Prosser came in. He put his hands on the back of a chair and looked at them. "I want to say a thing, and I'm going to do it badly." He cleared his throat. "In the chow line, what I said about bleeding with people, and how you can't read it off a piece of paper, that was—" He stopped. He started again. "The thing is, I meant it. That's what I need you to know. I wasn't being clever. I actually believed it, which is worse. I have believed that for 19 years, and I have said it out loud probably 400 times, and every one of those times there was somebody standing in the room that it was about." His hands were white on the chair back. "And then you took my whole crossing off a roof, and then you went in that ship for a man none of us even knew was in it, and you didn't tell anybody because you knew we'd say no. So here's what I've got. I said a thing in front of my men about a person I hadn't spoken 20 words to because it made me feel like the kind of man who knows things. That's all it was. And I'd like to take it back, and I can't, because Hoyle heard it, and Shaw heard it, and half of them will remember it longer than they'll remember the fuel farm." He made himself look at her. "I'm sorry, Sergeant. I was small about you in public, and you never once made me pay for it, and I'd have found it easier if you had." Lorna set down the bolt. "Walk it again with me," she said. "Sometime. Low water." Prosser's mouth moved. "Yeah," he said. "Okay. Yeah." Nell Rankin came up the hill on a Sunday in a blue dress, having taken 2 buses and walked the last mile, and stood at the gate and asked the sentry for "the woman from the water," because that was what her husband had called her, and she did not know any other name. They brought her to the shade by the chow tent, and Lorna came down, and Nell Rankin took hold of both of her hands and held on to them. "He can't come up the hill yet," she said. "The leg. He's very cross about it. He was cross the whole time I was working on him." "Yes." Nell laughed and her chin went. "Yes, he would be." She looked down at Lorna's hands like she was reading them. "I don't know any of your words. Amos comes home and he says apron and lane, and I don't know what any of it is, so I'm going to say it in mine, and you'll have to make do." "Yes, ma'am. He was going to be finished in 3 weeks, and we had a plan. We were going to go up the coast in September, and I was going to make him get in the water with me, and he doesn't know that I know about the swimming lessons. He's been getting up at 4:30 for a year, and coming home with wet hair and telling me he's been walking." Nell's voice went thin, and she pushed straight through it. "And what I want to say to you is that on Wednesday I was standing in my kitchen, and I was not being told anything, and there was a moment— there was a whole hour, love, where I understood that I was going to have to go on and do all of that on my own. I had already started thinking about it. And then the phone went." She squeezed Lorna's hands hard enough to hurt. "So, thank you for my husband." And Lorna Tolliver, who had lain on wet granite with a machine gun firing at 11 men and never lost a breath, opened her mouth and nothing came out of it. Nothing at all. She stood there in front of a woman in a blue dress, and her face came apart, and she got out about half of the word ma'am, and then the rest of it was just her shoulders going, and Nell Rankin put her arms around her the way you do with anybody, and over Nell's shoulder, Marion Osgood turned around and went back into her tent and made a lot of unnecessary noise with a pot. "There now," said Nell. "There. Hatcher did it in the big tent on a Monday morning with the whole element standing, and he did not build up to it. 2 things, and then we'll get to work. He had a page, and he did not look at it. First, 12 days ago I stood in this tent, and I sent Sergeant Tolliver out on that lane, and I told her in front of you that I'd read 3 words in her file and believed them. I want to correct the record because I said that like a confession, and it isn't one. A confession is something you do once. What I did was decide, before I had any evidence, that a person I'd never worked with was a lower quality version of the people I like, and then I built her duty roster around that decision for 11 days. That is not a bad moment. That is a habit, and it's mine, and some of you have got it too." Nobody moved. Somewhere at the back, Hoyle was looking at the floor. "Second, as of this morning, Sergeant Tolliver is on this task force's shooter roll as a primary, not as an attachment, with her own lane and her own call sign, and she signs her own range cards and nobody countersigns them. I've also endorsed a request for correction of her record from a previous command, and I want you all to know I did that, because I want you to know that a piece of paper can be wrong, and that when it is, we say so on our own letterhead." The room's face changed in pieces. Boland's first, because he already knew. Then Shaw, who turned his good ear and then just grinned like a fool. Prosser did not smile at all. He stood at the back with his arms folded and his eyes on the middle distance and nodded once, very slightly, the way a man does when someone finally says a thing he has been carrying around unsaid. Lorna, at the end of the second row, looked at the wall of the tent and went a little red and did not move at all, and later Boland told her that the funniest thing about the whole business was that being thanked was clearly the worst part of her month. Marion Osgood said it best in the end, and she said it to Prosser, of all people, which is how it got repeated. He was in the tent late, after everyone had gone, and she was wiping down, and he was drinking coffee he did not want, and he said, "You called it before any of us did. Boland says you saw something in her the first week." "I didn't see anything," Marion said. "I don't know guns. I've never held one, and I don't want to." She folded the cloth. "The tent nearly came down in that squall, and 4 of your men grabbed the pole, because that's the loud part. She walked past all of them and put her hand on the little rope at the bottom that nobody was looking at. She hung the cloth on the rail. That's the whole of it, Master Sergeant. Everything in this world is holding on somewhere. Most people go for the part that's making the noise. She goes and finds where it's holding on. Prosser sat with that for a while. "Yeah," he said, "that's it exactly." "I know it is," said Marion, and turned the light off over the servery. 14 months later, on a hot, bright Saturday, the port of Koran Bay reopened its container berth with a brass band that had 4 instruments and a mayor who spoke for 11 minutes, and there was a marquee on the apron and 150 folding chairs, and the lime green gantry crane had been painted, badly, in the same lime green. Lorna Tolliver came in on the coast road in a rental car with a bad clutch, wearing a shirt with a collar, out of place and glad to be. Amos Rankin had a stick and a limp he made much more of than he needed to, and he took her along the whole apron, introducing her to people as the beachcomber. And at 2:30 he made everybody come down to the ramp at the ferry slip where the water was flat and brown and warm as a bath. And he took off his shoes and his shirt and walked in up to his chest, and then, in front of 80 people and a band, put his feet up behind him and swam 30 ugly, thrashing, magnificent meters out to the second piling and back, and came up the ramp blowing like a horse with his face absolutely blazing. Nell was crying and hitting him with a hat. "You knew," he said. "You knew the whole time." A year of wet hair, Amos. Owen Trace ran the barbecue and would not let Lorna pay for anything, and every 20 minutes came and stood near her without talking, which she understood perfectly. Emmett Shaw drove up from the coast at 4 with a hearing aid in his left ear he was entirely unembarrassed about, and a fiancée who taught 7th grade. And he was out of the task force now and teaching at a schoolhouse in the Pine Country, observation and reporting. And he told Lorna he used her crossing in a block of instruction and that his students didn't believe the timeline. "Do you show them the tide table?" "Every time. Every single time, ma'am. It's the whole lesson." He grinned. "Half of them still say it's not possible." "Good," said Lorna. "Let them go walk a mole." Gil Prosser had put his papers in the previous autumn and was running a range in the low hills 200 miles inland, and he had driven 11 hours for a barbecue, which he explained twice, unconvincingly, as a coincidence. He'd got heavier and he laughed more. He stood with her at the rail, looking out over the flats at the gray line of the mole, with the water halfway up it, and neither of them said anything for a while. "They took the ferry off then," he said. "Cut her up in March. Amos said it took 6 weeks. Feels wrong. It was full of holes." Prosser snorted. Then after a minute, "I tell the story at the range. I want you to know that. I don't tell it as the 11. Everybody wants the 11. He turned his glass. "I tell them about day 3. Woman gets to a place she's never been and walks the whole harbor at low water with a compass, and everyone standing at the fence calls it beachcombing. That's the part they need. That's the part nobody remembers. Nobody's unreachable," Prosser said. "That's what I say to them. There's a way into everything. The way just isn't open all day, and if you're not out there looking at it on day 3, you won't know when it is." Later in the yellow evening, Nell Rankin took Lorna inside to see the house they'd bought at the top of the lane, and the kitchen was small and yellow and smelled of the bay, and Nell put the plug in the sink and turned the tap on to wash 2 cups. The sound of water going into a basin in a small closed room. Lorna was outside on the step before she had made any decision about it. She stood in the garden with her heart slamming and her hands cold, looking at a rosemary bush, breathing to a count of 12, and by the time Nell came out with the tea towel over her shoulder, her face was completely ordinary again. "Air's better out here," Lorna said. "It is," said Nell, who had put the tap on quietly ever since. For the rest of the time she knew her, and never once mentioned why. "Sit down, love. He's going to want to tell you about the swimming again." She drove out along the seawall road before the light went, and stopped, and walked up the crushed shell path to the salt house. It was a store again, full of pallets and a smell like a mineral hospital, and the roof ladder was still on the north wall, and nobody stopped her going up. The tide was out. The mole ran away southwest into the flats with its head standing dry and proud, and the low sun laid flat along it, and a mile out you could hear the water starting to come back over the mussel bed with that sound like frying. Down on the apron the band was packing up. Somebody was laughing about something. There is a wooden box bolted to the wall of the harbor master's office at Coron Bay with a laminated card in it, and the card is a copy of 1 page of a pencil notebook, and every new hand on that port gets walked down to it in their first week and told the same thing. Walk it at low water before you think you know it. Half of them think it's a joke. Then some morning 3 years later, one of them is standing on the flats with the water coming and remembers which way to run. Lorna Tolliver stood at the parapet with her hands in her pockets and her eyes level, looking at the water finding its way back into the harbor along the roads it had always used, and after a while she went down the ladder and got in the car and drove north into the evening with the window open.